Let's take an inflation-inspired trip down memory lane. Hi, I'm John McNeil, and this is the Invest Strong Network. Welcome. So, all the concern in the economy these days and in investing is the rise in inflation. Now, currently, depending upon how it's measured, uh, inflation is running anywhere from 5 to 7.5% here in the United States of America. And I know I've certainly seen the escalation in prices, groceries, fuel, everything really over the last few months. Now, this situation really kind of begs us to go back in the past and examine carefully the last time an inflationary environment like this existed. And in fact, the previous time an inflationary environment like this existed, it was in fact far, far worse than what we're experiencing at this moment. So let's do exactly that. Let's go back to the middle to late 1970s, right? And we will judge some of the parallels and then also some of the deviations, see what we can learn from the entire comparison. Okay, so again, it's the middle to late 1970s. The nation is reeling from a stinging foreign policy disaster. Our ally, South Vietnam, which we had really been propping up for the last decade and a half at an enormous cost in treasure and blood, just collapsed into a pile of nothing once our guys left. Definitely a parallel there, right? Also, the nation was coming off of a scandal racked Republican administration that had been run out of town, only to be replaced by a, shall we say, honest but lackluster Democrat who had taken over the White House. Another parallel there, too, right? Now, this is where things begin to deviate. In the middle to late 1970s, the Soviet Union was everywhere. They were fomenting revolution in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. Their economy was propped up by high fuel prices because really the Soviet Union, as Russia is today, was really a petro economy, right? And also, you had overhanging all of this the Arab oil embargo. So the Arabs had really reduced the supply of all oil on the global market to protest American support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Once they realized that their manipulation of the fuel markets could be sustained, then they began to just do it constantly. That rise in fuel prices had a profound impact on inflation and on everyday life in the United States of America and really globally, but especially here, since our economy was a huge manufacturing and transportation economy. Basically, anything that had to be moved or produced or whatever was way more expensive because of what the Arabs were doing in the middle to late 1970s. Now, the Carter administration tried to counter this by encouraging Americans to be far more frugal in their energy consumption, right? The Carter administration also made a pretty strong move towards the solar and renewable energies, yes, even back then. But these things simply didn't really uh, grasp the imagination of the American people. And the renewables that we would need to kind of extricate ourselves from the need for foreign oil, well, that would take years, in fact, really decades to implement to the point to where it would have a palpable effect on the situation. Inflation was basically in this country caused by that. Now, there were some other things involved. I mean, we had our federal government running fairly significant budget deficits back then, as it is today. And we also had a rise in global powers, right? Some of the emerging markets, they were running up the demand for oil as their economies were also growing. And so all of these things kind of had an effect on the price of everything. And from basically 1976 until really the early 1980s, inflation year over year was running in the middle to high teens. That's just way, way higher than it is currently. And in fact, it was so bad, the nation's economy and really the entire structure of politics and economics in this country was put in dire crisis, right? Now, again, the Carter administration did some things. They brought in Paul Volcker, this real inflation hawk from academia to run the Federal Reserve. Now, Mr. Volcker was a good guy and understood how the economy worked and all, but he knew instinctively that in order to drive down inflation, you would have to first drive down demand. Now, the only way you really drive down demand is by dampening the economy, and the best way to dampen the economy is to raise interest rates. Now, for the Dems and the Carter administration, which were in power, well, this was a disaster, right? Because this run up in interest rates would devastate the economy, which in fact it did, and would make it virtually impossible for Mr. Carter to be reelected in the 1980 election. And they knew that. And they were trying their best to put the reins on Mr. Volcker and kind of prevent this catastrophe from happening like this, even though that was really the medicine that was needed to break the back of inflation. Now, it's now the late 1970s and very early 1980s. And the Reagan administration succeeds the Carter administration. Now, Mr. Volcker is still at the Federal Reserve. And at the very beginning of his administration, President Reagan basically gave Chairman Volcker the green light to do basically whatever it took to bring inflation down. And in fact, the Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates really into the middle to high teens. That, of course, put the country into recession, a deep recession, as a matter of fact. And demand for all things began to drop. But this war against inflation was augmented and really accelerated by an unexpected source. Really, I would say the champion for the United States of America for defeating the monster of inflation was, of all persons, why, Saddam Hussein. Now, why do I say that, you ask? Well, the Shia Muslims took over the government of Iran in 1979. Saddam Hussein, a Sunni Muslim, absolutely despised the Shia government there. 1980, he launches this massive invasion of Iran. Now, in order to fight this existential war between the two, both nations, the third largest oil producer in the world, Iran, and the fifth largest oil producer in the world, Iraq, pulled every drop of fuel they could, of oil they could, out of the ground and flooded the global markets, right? By them doing this, that drove the price of oil down from the high 40s that it really had stubbornly been in through most of the late 70s and early 1980s, down to as low as $8 a barrel by 1982. That was a tremendous relief for all manufacturing, all transportation, everything in the country the prices began to come down as everything became easier and cheaper to transport. Now, the Reagan administration augmented the energy policy with a hammer blow on unions, as union wages were far too high and they were driving the escalating prices of goods. And by smashing the unions, this was another means of bringing down inflation. Also, although it's not often remembered or reported, the Reagan administration had a rather aggressive policy towards immigration, right? So they allowed far more legal immigration than previous administrations, and in fact, came to an agreement with the Dems in order to give legal status to millions of previously undocumented workers in the United States of America, thus greatly expanding the legal labor pool and again putting pressure, downward pressure on wages. And eventually, all of these things in combination would finally break the back of inflation by the middle 1980s. And in fact, since then, inflation would run at a target of 2 to 3.5% or so annual. And that's really what the Federal Reserve is looking for, right? And that's where we had been up until just recently. Now, here's the thing. What the Reagan administration did during that period, especially as it relates to their war on unions and also the immigration, it did in fact work to drive down prices. But these things would have a profound social effect for years to come, including currently, right? So those are some things to think about. The inflation wave, the previous inflation wave of the late 1970s and early 1980s, this was driven by the high price of fuel, not by the endless printing of money and creation of digits and quantitative easing that is behind the current wave of inflation. But at the end of the day, it'll have to be broken the same way. That is, demand will have to come down. All right. So, hope you found this analysis insightful and informative. If so, hit that thumbs up button. I'd appreciate it. Also, let me know if you have any thoughts or experiences from that period of time. Let me know what was going through your mind during the late 1970s and early 1980s as it relates to inflation. And of course, subscribe! Please inflate your wisdom and subscribe to Invest Strong. I'd appreciate it. Thank you so much, and good blessings.